In this movie, we'll take a look at how we can go from this to that. Let's dive in. So the question is, how do we go from the original capture, which appears like this straight out of the camera, how do we go from this to that? Well, that's exactly what we will be talking about in this week's episode. Hi, my name is Chris Orwig, and I come to you every week in order to share some tips and techniques for capturing and creating better photographs. And in this week's episode, we are up in the mountains in Oregon, and we're working in Lightroom Classic. And here I want to walk through a workflow which will involve using our basic settings here, as well as some other adjustments and some selective adjustments as well. So let's start off here in the basic panel in the develop module. One of the first things that I want to do is modify my exposure and contrast. Now the exposure is actually pretty close, but I will brighten that just a little bit. Now if you want to make small adjustments to things like exposure or any of these sliders, you can hover your cursor over the slider and then tap the up arrow key. Can you notice how I'm going up by 10 or tenth of a, what is it? I can't even say it right, but by a tenth at a time. So just a small increment there. I also want to bring up my contrast, and I'm just going to boost that up. And as I'm setting these, I'm aware that I can recover more detail because that kind of crushed some of the shadows there. So we'll bring those up. We're going to bring them up to a pretty high value here. So I'm going to bring them up somewhere around here. Highlights, want to make sure those are not too bright. You can also tap the J key. That will turn on your clipping indicator, showing you if you have any problems. In this case, we don't, so we can move ahead. Now, clarity with an image like this will make a really nice snap. Can you see the difference? Let me zoom in a little bit here. I love this dog here on the front of the kayak. So here you can see before and after and how that just adds a really nice snap to the overall image. So I'm going to add some clarity there to the photograph. Then when you bring up clarity, you almost always need to bring a little bit of vibrance and saturation up as well in order to maintain the color that you have in the image. So if you're bringing up clarity, it desaturates. So then you need to bring up these values too. Now, we don't need to bring them up that high, but I just wanted to point that out is an important part of the workflow. So I'm bringing up my clarity to the high 20s. That's actually a lot for a photograph like this. So then I need to bring up my vibrance and saturation there as well. Okay, well, let's walk through the rest of our workflow. We'll go to the tone curve panel. In the tone curve panel, one of the things I notice is that my highlights are really right about here, right? So you can see that the highlights start right there. So the whites are not bright enough. So what I'm going to do is brighten those up. We could have also done this with the white slider, but sometimes it's helpful to look at the histogram and see that little issue. And I'm just going to brighten up some of the brighter tones here and then bring the blacks back down. And you can see the before and after with this one. It looks like it's just sort of snapping the image up a little bit, and that looks nice. Now you want to tap the J key on your keyboard, and if you tap the J key and you see a lot of red, that's telling you that you moved this point too far. So we want to bring that back to where we aren't seeing any clipping, because that red is showing us clipping where we have our highlights that are overexposed. So again, just tap the J key to turn that on and off. All right, well, good work with our tone curve there. We made through that. Next, we're going to jump down to the detail panel. Now, in the detail panel, we often want to be able to zoom in to actually see the image at the right zoom rate to evaluate the sharpening and noise reduction. One way you can do that is by clicking on that exclamation point there. Now we're back to our fearless dog. And you want to pan around the image, and one of the things that you'll see back here, we see some noise. In the sky, we see noise. So the way that we're going to get rid of that is that's luminance noise. So I need to bring that luminance value up, and that's really going to smoothen that out. Now, if we didn't have any color noise reduction on, we would see color noise in the shadows and areas. So typically for most images, I find this is somewhere around the 30s or so, and that's probably an appropriate rate for this particular photograph. Now let's go back to our subjects here in the foreground. What about sharpening? Well, if we bring our sharpening value up, it's going to definitely add a little more kind of snap to the photograph, but all the little details, I want to take this down because I want to preserve those. I want this to be a little bit more about edge sharpening. So the higher this is, the more the little details are sharpened. The lower it is, the less those are sharpened. So this will help prevent from over sharpening skin tones or other areas. So typically with portraiture, you have a low value there. It doesn't need to be 0 for this image necessarily, but somewhere below 10 is probably pretty good. Next, what about masking? Well, if you hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on Windows, and drag the slider, it will give you this black and white overlay. Let me zoom out so you can see that a little bit better. Can you see how it's showing me an area that's black, other areas that are white? Now, whatever is white will receive the sharpening. Whatever is black will not. So in this case, it's going to protect the boat, the lake, and if we were to look up here into the sky, let me do that again, you can see it's limiting the sharpening to the sky and clouds. We don't need to sharpen that. We just want all of those edges to look their best. Great. So we have that taken care of. Then we're going to go down to lens corrections. Now, removing chromatic aberration is typically a good idea, especially if you have trees and branches or if you're shooting in a really shallow depth of field. So I'll just turn that on and let it take care of auto. I didn't see any big issues there, but that will correct any that I might have overlooked. Enabling profile corrections, what that does is it detects the camera and the lens combo, in this case a 24 to 70 millimeter lens. It corrects a little bit of distortion that we had and also some vignetting. Now what's interesting about this is something which is correcting a problem, a quote problem with the lens. But you have to ask yourself, which version do you like better? And in my opinion, I actually like it without that turned on. I like the density, I like the look, I like the feeling. So you don't always have to turn this one on. Okay, well now that we have done all of that, we have a few more things that we can do with this image. One of them is if you look back here, some of these details are a little bit soft, and I want to add a bit more snap to that area. How can we do that? Well, if we grab our brush, what we can then do is choose an effect, and here I'm just going to choose sharpness. And I have a sharpness value here. Auto mask turned on. My flow is going to be pretty high, somewhere close to 100. Doesn't need to be all the way up. Brush, let's make that a little bit bigger. And then I'll tap the T key to bring back my toolbar, and I want to show the selected mask overlay. Because as I start to paint, I'm not going to really be able to see if the sharpening effect looks good because I'm zoomed out, right? But what this does for me is it helps me see how this effect is being applied. So whatever is red is the area which will receive the effect that I'm painting in. So you can see as I'm going through here, I can go to the edge. As long as the crosshairs there are not going over the sky, I'll be in pretty good shape with this. Now you may be wondering, okay, well what about the trees, the treetops up there? What we want to do for that is zoom way in, make the brush smaller, tap the left bracket key to do that, and then just click and paint over that. And again, just be careful with that the crosshairs. It's a little plus icon in the center of the tool. Make sure you're just getting the area that you want to. And this is important because it will help to make this cohesive with the rest of the tree. Now, if you have trees with a lot of leaves and this isn't quite working, just try a lower flow value and then paint over it. And what you can kind of do is slowly build it up over the areas which need it most. These trees are pretty well defined, so it doesn't really matter. Now, this overlay is just showing me which area is being affected by the adjustment. Another way we could see that is by making an exaggerative adjustment, right? Like dragging this up and saying, okay, it's just that area. Well, what I want to do with that area, yeah, sure, I want to sharpen it, but I also want to add a little bit of clarity and maybe a touch of dehaze. Then I'll boost my shadows. I'm going to bring those shadows back up and perhaps maybe just warm it up just a little bit there too and bring the blacks up. The dehaze actually, as I'm looking at it, I think it was kind of too strong, but let me show you what we have here so you can evaluate for yourself. There's that before. And then here's the after. Can you see how it's sort of just illuminating that part of the image? It's not over the top. It's not really exaggerative. It's not, I don't know, fake or something like that. It's still sort of honoring the look of this beautiful shot without making it feel over processed. And that's really important because you don't want to like over sharpen something or under sharpen it or soften it out or whatever it is. You want it to have a really nice feel. You don't want, again, too much saturation, too little. Now, if you wanted to work on the mountain back there, I would do another adjustment. So here, again, I'm just going to choose an option, say clarity, and add some clarity. Actually, let me undo that for a second. Let me first make a new adjustment, then choose the option of clarity. And with clarity, I'll boost that up, and I'll use my brush just like before, and I'm just going to paint over the mountain. Now, I can't really tell where I've painted. Do you remember what we need to do? we need to turn on that mask overlay. The O key is the shortcut to be able to do that. My flow is a little bit too low because I want this adjustment to be uniform over this whole area. So I'm just going to increase that flow value there. And the way that you do that is just dragging that slider that we had over here on the right. So just bringing that up so we have a very high flow value. Now, if I just want to work on the mountain and not the trees down here, just click on the erase option. And we can then go through here. Auto mask still turned on. We can say, hey, you know what? This kind of spilled over into this other region. I want to make sure this is just for the mountain. Now, to get rid of the red overlay, let me zoom in so you can see that. To get rid of that, what we can do is we can press the O key. Let me just make sure those edges are all looking good. Perfect. So I'll tap the O key. That overlay is now gone. Now what we're seeing is my adjustment. So as I make an adjustment to this area, let me make an exaggerative adjustment so you can see, yes, that is what we are affecting. I'm going to bring up my contrast, maybe make this a little bit more blue because mountains should kind of have that. I don't know, it's fun to have that like that blue sort of a look to it. Maybe sharpen them a little bit, maybe a little less saturation so it removes, it's not quite such a strong blue there, something like that. Okay, it's always hard to talk and to edit. Now the mountain doesn't look very good to me, but we'll talk about that in a second. But can you see my before and after there? Now, the reason why it's not looking good to me is it's just overdone. I think because I was zoomed in, I kind of got excited about the color, and that happens a lot. So what you want to do is you want to collapse all your controls. They'll turn into an amount slider, and then you can just drag this down. And as you drag this down, you can see now it's less than half what the effect of what it was before. It's a good idea to zoom out and make sure that looks good there. Okay, well, that's looking great. Just one more adjustment, then we will wrap this one up. Here I will click on the icon, which allows us to make a radial filter. And from the pull-down menu, I'm going to choose exposure and just slightly brighten my exposure a little bit, boost my shadows just a touch, very high feather value. And I'm going to click and drag over this area of the image. Now let me exaggerate for a moment so you can see which area I'm affecting. So in this case, you can see I have this bright white shape over the main subject of the photograph. Let me zoom in on that so you can see this better. And the edge is very harsh and hard because I have no feather. But if we increase this and bring this close to 100, can you see how now, even though it's really high amount, it kind of is blending in. I mean, it's sort of amazing. Yes, that's too high for this kind of an image, but you can see how that feather slider really helps out. And I'm going to add a little more color, a little bit of a warmth to that part of the image. Basically, what I'm looking to do is to have sort of this nice bright light on that subject. So it's going to draw all the attention to our subject there. I'm going to change the shape now that I have my settings dialed in. If I made a mistake like I did last time, remember last time the mountain, I had over-processed that part of the image. Well, if I've made that mistake here, again, same workflow. Collapse all of those controls to a single slider. I think of this kind of like an opacity slider in Photoshop if you use Photoshop. And here we can just find just the right amount. I'm just looking for a little splash of light right there. Yeah, can you see how that's really nice? Let me zoom in so you can see that. So here's our before, and then here now is the after. Just drawing the viewer into the main subject. There are other subjects here, right? The lake is a subject, the guy in the background, the trees, the mountain, the sky, but that's kind of my main subject here in the photograph. Okay, well, I said that was the last step, but there really is one more, and it's cropping. The other image that I showed you previously, I'd cropped in a little bit. And the reason I did that, I think, was just to come into the scene here a little bit more so that it's just a little bit of a tighter crop, and I think I just like the feeling of that. Here, I'll press the F key to go to full screen mode, and when we do that, we can see this image in full screen here. And that's a great view of what we've created so far. And just to reiterate kind of what we've done here, let me exit out of full screen mode. My computer's stuttering here for a second, and it's also not rendering the preview there. There we go. I think that's better. And just to go through what we did is we worked in the basic panel. Then we also did a little bit of work here in the tone curve. Remember how that added that nice little snap to the image? We did that by changing our white point and then brightening and darkening a little bit with a couple other points. We did some work in our detail panel, sharpening and reducing noise. We looked at lens corrections. We turned on remove chromatic aberration because really it's never that bad of an idea to do that. but we didn't necessarily like the profile correction, so I left that one off. So we left that unchecked. And then we went to a couple of localized adjustments. We looked at how we could paint in some adjustments on the mountains back there. We used that adjustment brush. We made 2 separate adjustments. And then we finished the adjustments off with one more, adding a little bit of light to our subject there in the foreground. And last but not least, we used the crop tool to crop and recompose the image. All right, well, that is a wrap for today. Thanks so much for joining me. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.